Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to, of course, another album of the week. This, of course, is episode number 84. Now, this week's pick goes to, of course, the 8th studio album from Iron Maiden, that is No Prayer for the Dying, which this past Thursday reached 30 years. Yes, it reached 30 years old, because it was released to, of course, EMI and Capitol on October 1st, 1990. So, depending on who you ask when it comes to this infamous record from Iron Maiden, this is either usually regarded, and for the most part, most everybody tends to consider this as one of Iron Maiden's worst albums. There's at least a few people, maybe not a huge percentage, but definitely at least a decent percentage of people that will consider this at least one of Iron Maiden's better albums from at least from the post Power Slave era of Iron Maiden. But for the most part, who you tend to ask, it's usually regarded as one of the worst albums. And this is usually by people that tend to actually rate Seventh Son of Seventh Son and Somewhere in Time as one of their best, when in reality, by the time this album had came out, everybody had already given up on Iron Maiden. Everybody gave up on this band. And why many people had given up on Iron Maiden, well, we have to actually, the story, it all goes back to 1986 with, of course, Somewhere in Time. It all goes back to Somewhere in Time. So, that's, I guess, in many ways, let's actually go back to that period before we really end up back to, of course, until we actually end up on No Prayer for the Dying and what leads up to this record. So, let's definitely go back to, of course, also for a little bit here. Let's definitely go back to, of course, the very first album in 1980, which, of course, was the self-titled album, which I've already spotlighted on this channel as a album of the week when it reached its 40th anniversary. So, when that album came out, again, it was actually considered a underground hit. Again, just based on the artwork, depending on who you asked, everyone bought the record because of its artwork. And when they brought the album home, it became a big fan favorite, and Iron Maiden were starting to begin to grow as, again, one of the top bands of the new wave or British heavy metal movement. And of course, beginning, of course, with the earlier stuff, but prior, like, again, the Soundhouse tapes, it's just the debut album was just the beginning, and from there, it just led to classics like Killers, and then the Made in Japan EP, which, of course, was the final release for Paul Di'Anno, and then, of course, Bruce Dickinson. That's led to, of course, the second classic, and also Iron Maiden's rise to, of course, stadium fame with Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, and of course Power Slave. And again, it was the Power Slave tour that they really saw probably the best ticket sales. They were just selling out stadiums. They were literally were becoming one of the youngest, hugest bands alive. As of course, again, to the whole world, the World Slavery Tour, which of course is where, of course, the Live After Death album was recorded on. It was recording on that tour, and that was that was some of the biggest shows they ever put on. And again, the record itself it sold like gangbusters. It was one of the biggest selling records for Iron Maiden. They were they were at their peak at that point. They were just seeing so much success. That's, of course, then everything took a turn by the time Somewhere in Time came out, and from the accounts, from at least when listening to, of course, people that grew up in that period that were Iron Maiden fans, from their point of view, everyone pretty much from their opinions and the whole of just their reaction to when Somewhere in Time came out, they were all taken back. It was the same way they were taken back by Turbo from Judas Priest, and this sound was no different. While nowadays, when you ask, they'll say they'll definitely would take Somewhere in Time in a heartbeat over Turbo, but at that time, they pretty much saw Somewhere in Time as nothing, no different from Turbo. They were all just from the synth guitar sound and just the overly produced production. To them, it just wasn't the same, because this was not the same band that gave them Power Slave, Peace of Mind, Number of the Beast, and of course the first two albums of Paul Di'Anno. It definitely was not that same band anymore, and it wasn't the same band that was giving them, the most highest quality live record that was Live After Death. It wasn't the same band anymore, and of course they eventually did buy the record. I think most of them did, but to them, it didn't make it no longer made them any newer fans. If anything, it actually turned a lot of fans away from Iron Maiden. And then it ended up being no different when Seventh Son of Seventh Son came out. Nowadays, who you ask, that's now considered one of the greatest Iron Maiden albums, where it's now being considered a masterpiece. But again, just like how they reacted towards Somewhere in Time, they reacted the same towards Seventh Son of Seventh Son, and it didn't make any of their reactions any better when the lead-off song for the album was "Can I Play with Madness?" It doesn't make any better. And so it definitely completely just turned fans away, and the production was even more thinner, and again, the synths and so on, it just turned a whole lot of people away. And so when No Prayer for the Dying finally came out, everybody had just jumped off to begin with. To them, they weren't even fazed by the fact that Iron Maiden had a new album out. It didn't do anything, it didn't make any more newer fans, it just was it. And to go back to Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, that was the last album for a while for Adrian Smith, until, of course, Brave New World in 2000, when Bruce Dickinson was coming back into the fold when Adrian Smith came back. But Seventh Son of a Seventh Son was the final record for Adrian Smith, and by No Prayer for the Dying, they, of course, required Yannick Gers, who, of course, prior to Iron Maiden, played with bands like White Spirit, and of course Gillan, again replacing Bernie Tormé and Gillan. So he was again playing for, of course, like Ian Gillan and that. And the thing is, I think what kind of led to him being the replacement for Adrian Smith was after doing the track "Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter" with Bruce Dickinson for, of course, I believe it was The Dream Child, the Nightmare on Elm Street film. The Dream Child, I believe, was where Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter was used on. That was at least the first collaboration between Bruce Dickinson and Yannick Gers. And that's, of course, after that, it was then very much apparent that he was then, I think Steve Harris was all sold on the fact that on his playing that he was then chose as the replacement for Adrian Smith. So finally, that then led to, of course, the recording and the writing process for No Prayer for the Dying. And of course, again, it brought in a new lineup that would last for pretty much for the most portion of the 1990s, and Yannick Gers became just a permanent member for Iron Maiden. So by the time Adrian Smith came back in, it was then a 6-piece now. 3-piece guitar, again, 3 guitar players now. But this was his debut. And so by October 1st of 1990, when the album finally came out, again, it didn't break any dents in their in the Billboard or anything. It didn't do much for the band as far as it. I mean, it probably sold less than the albums prior. Maybe. I think that I don't have Wikipedia on, so right now though I probably don't give a fuck to actually go to Wikipedia to look at the record sales and then the Billboard charts and shit like that. I don't have to really look up much. Still, I know at least I can take a good guess that it at least didn't do much for them as far as sales are concerned. So, No Prayer for the Dying. Let's just get in. What made this, and nowadays, what makes this album to be considered the worst Iron Maiden album? What made people really come to their opinions on how this album is the worst in Iron Maiden's discography? Before I get into any of my thoughts, let's definitely do a track listing rundown. All right. As far as lead-off singles, Tail Gunner is, of course, what was one of the first lead singles for it, along with Holy Smoke. And, of course, Bring Your Dog to the Slaughter was a lead-off single as well, yeah. The song, of course, I guess Steve Harris liked the track so much that he wanted to then record his version for it. So, two versions of Bring Your Dog to the Slaughter exist. One that was with solely Bruce Dickinson and Janet Gers, and one that's just done by Iron Maiden with Bruce Dickinson and Janet Gers. So those at least were the three lead singles. But as far as that, again, there's at least 10 songs here. Again, Tail Gunner, Holy Smoke, the title track, Public Enema, number 1, Fate's Warning, The Assassin, Run Silent, Run Deep, Hooks in You, of course, the aforementioned Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter, and then, of course, Mother Russia. And this album all clocks in at 44 minutes and 7 seconds. Definitely, as far as time length, isn't nearly any longer than Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. I will say this right off the bat, it's at least a breath of fresh air to have at least an Iron Maiden album that's at least somewhere within 44 minutes, that doesn't even go beyond that length. Closer to 50 minutes, or these days fucking 70 minutes. It's at least a breath of fresh air, alright? I'll go on to that. But on to the album itself. I mean, Martin Birch is back producing for this album. And as far as the goals for this album, I mean, production-wise, it still has that thin kind of sound compared to Seventh Son of Seventh Son. But as far as when you really go down and actually take a good comparison, a side by side, I would say it does end up being night and day. Because Seventh Son of Seventh Son was definitely more really so produced. It still had and it was even thinner, and definitely sounded more digital sounding. Where compared to this one, this is probably what was more of an attempt to kind of get back to the more natural production, just the natural sound of course, so let's say like a Power Slave and Peace of Mind and Number of the Beast, and of course the first two albums with Paul Di'Anno. It was probably an attempt to get back then, and for the most part, it does have a more of a natural feel, even though it does sound a little thinner compared to at least some of those. I mean, there's still, again, it's just off the heels of Seventh Son of Seventh Son, but it definitely does tend to sound a little more natural sounding, and there's less, keyboards. I mean, they're there, but I think it's used a little more. What's just the best word? I wouldn't say micromanaged, but there definitely aren't. It's not as so overuse. They're not overused in the sense they're just using it to when they need to use them, and especially apparent on tracks like the title track, Fate's Warning, and The Assassin. Of course, they even Run Silent, Run Deep. And of course, even for some part, even Mother Russia, if I am correct, again. Still, I think they're very apparent on those kind of tracks. Again, especially the track No Prayer for the Dying. It's definitely apparent on there when it comes to at least the synths. But again, it's used as atmosphere than really as again as something like with Somewhere in Time or Seventh Son to Seventh Son. Even though Seventh Son to Seventh Son I've come to at least appreciate, because at least they do try to use at least the keyboards at least for the most part as atmosphere. That at least safe for come play with madness, which really it's even more apparent. Still though, this here it's definitely not literally as used as much, which I think definitely works for what I think the album is, for what they're trying to achieve with this album in many ways, and when it comes to, of course, the production and again the synths. So. Musically, this of course was the first taste for at least for the Iron Maiden crowd with Yannick Gers. This was the first taste I think of them, because I'm not sure how many U.S. Iron Maiden fans actually were aware of Wide Spearn and Gillan. Nowadays, you'll definitely get some people that were aware of Yannick Gers and Gillan, but prior to this, how many fans were aware of Yannick Gers and Ian Gillan's band Gillan? I don't know. I think it may not be as much, especially nowadays. Still, though, this was, I think, for the most part, on a wider scale, was at least everybody's first taste of him. And you do get that. In many ways, you do get that. I mean, the album does, both Tail Gunner and Holy Smoke are definitely more upbeat. And not nearly fast, but they definitely are more upbeat, straight up rockers, for sure. They definitely tend to kind of go back to the more upbeat rocking feel, of course, of stuff that you at least had kind of heard on Number of the Beast and maybe the first two albums, and as well as even for some part, Power Slave. They're kind of trying to go back a little bit, but in some ways, I think in some ways, they somewhat feel at times a little bit undeveloped at times. Togun, I think, is so close to at least being the most consistent track, whereas Holy Smoke, on the other hand, while I applaud the fact, or appreciate the fact as well, that they're obviously are finally kind of, are at least commentating, or definitely are giving are definitely addressing the whole the religious, the overly religious feel of the religious just completely attacking, media and so on, that doesn't see their kind of views and so on. At least I kind of don't mind the fact that they're calling out on that, but at the same time, I feel that at some points it does feel a little bit edgy at times, and at times it does. There's some cringy parts I feel in Holy Smoke, especially when every time you got Bruce Dickinson, who's trying his best to probably the channel Paul Di'Anno in terms of the attitude, but I don't know if I've ever heard Paul Di'Anno very much in a lot of the songs actually use the word shit. And for some reason, with this pseudo tough guy voice, which I know in some ways Bruce Dickinson has used his kind of almost very raspy, gruffy voice that he back in Samson, but for some reason here it just comes off a little bit try-hard. Like he definitely is trying a little bit too hard to sound street tough. Now on here, it's definitely the biggest offender of him really trying to sound completely street tough. So it's probably the weakest song on here when it comes to at least track for at least songs, at least on No Prayer for the Dying here. I think Holy Smoke is the weakest by far. It's definitely one, again, when I first heard this album, I didn't really hate this record as much as maybe, again, after years of being told this is their worst album, when I finally heard the record, I'm like, this isn't nearly bad at all, but Holy Smoke was always one of the songs that I just felt was a little bit underwhelming. It's definitely the weakest song by far from Iron Maiden here. Now, again, Tail Gunner is probably, again, the best, at least, of the opening songs, but I feel the album I feel it's underrated parts of the album where I think it just gets good for me is with the title track. This, of course, is probably the first taste of at least the feel that you would get with some of the more modern day Iron Maiden albums, especially with, for example, even the Blaze Bayley era. This is kind of the first taste of that kind of feel. It does, again, No Prayer for the Dying, this song here kind of feels, again, it feels a little bit ahead of them, a little bit ahead as far as their playing. It definitely feels more like modern day Iron Maiden even though when you finally get to, of course, the actual the guitar solo part in the song, it does get heavy. It finally does speed up. And I really do like that. I think this is probably one of the best paced as far as again composed songs. I like, again, it builds up. It's slow. It's very moody. And at times, very even melancholic at times. I mean, with even the lyrics at times. This is probably, again, probably one of the best written songs on the album. One of the best, at least, in my opinion. One of the best written songs. Definitely shows that there's some emotion here, at least. It definitely sounds like classic Maiden in some ways. Bruce Dickinson definitely does end up owning this song for sure. He definitely starts to really sound more like classic Bruce Dickinson here, and with the lyrics and so on, I think it works. And then again, when it finally builds to the solo part, it's a great track. So really, it's one of the best songs on the album. So definitely it's one of the high points for me on the album again, but it definitely seems to give you the hint on what they're going to do with the Blaze Bayley era and some of the rest of the modern day era Iron Maiden albums in some aspects. So it's definitely a really cool track. On to the other songs. Public Enigma #1. It's a fine track too. I actually don't mind this track. It definitely, again, it kind of gives you the idea of what's going to come with the more modern era Iron Maiden albums at times. But it's a great track. It's, again, very melodic, but still has a rockin' feel to it. I still like this. Now, my personal favorite track now finally comes up. That's Fate's Warning. This track, it just starts off kind of slow and melancholic at times. It just has that kind of moody feel. Then it finally breaks into the song. And again, it's a very melodic, heavy track. And again, it rocks. I think this is definitely one of my personal favorites off the album. Every time this song comes up, it just has a way of giving me goosebumps. I feel this is definitely one of the most underrated Iron Maiden songs, for sure. This and the title track, I think, are both underrated. They're just, I think, are definitely solid fucking tracks. And yet there's still at least one more or two underrated songs on this album, for sure. The Assassin comes up, and I do like this track. It's, again, another one of those. It's just, so for some reason, this album definitely harkened the beginning of the more modern day era Iron Maiden sound, but it's a lot more subdued here, and definitely is a little more, a little bit strained. But in some ways, I think that might sound bad, but I think they're not literally going as overboard as with at least the more modern albums, when everything just gets so drowned out. Everything here does sound, again, that they're at least are using it to better advantage, and I think Assassin definitely has a cool feel. I like this track. Rust Time Run Deep is another good track I actually like off this one. So in many ways, I think so. Some of the underrated points of this album, really, I think is like you just get a slew of several great underrated tracks with No Prayer for the Dying, Fate's Warning, The Assassin, Rust Time Run Deep, and that's about it. And then, of course, we're then with Hooks and You, which kind of goes back to the more fun feel, at least, of Tail Gunner and Holy Smoke at times. This one, again, I actually think of the funner songs on this one that are more tongue-in-cheek and are not really the less serious. I think, again, this is probably the better of at least of some of the more funner songs on here. Again, it just has a nice boogie feel to it, actually. It's just very much, that's the best way. It's got a very sort of cool boogie feel to it, and for some reason, I like it. I mean, it's not amazing or by any means, but I think it's an okay freaking track, and I think, again, it's just a good fun rocker, so I can't really complain too much about the track. So Hooks and You isn't too bad. I mean, the lyrics definitely so tongue-in-cheek. It's probably the closest you might get to more of, the almost sex kind of lyrics, I guess, from Iron Maiden. This is probably, again, close to that. Same goes for the Bring Your Dogs to the Slaughter. I mean, they both seem to definitely deal with the more ideas of maybe sex at times. The last time they ever had anything close to that was more so, at least in the Paul Di'Anno era. I know some will probably say, well, 22 Acacia Avenue. That was more about the depravity of at least of how bad at least sex can get, especially when it comes to the really darker side of that kind of aspect. But still here, I think this one is more so close to the Paul Di'Anno era kind of stuff. And again, it's fine. Bring Your Daughter to the Sun, on the other hand, this track I've never hated. I know this is usually regarded one of the worst songs on the album, and it's actually considered one of the worst Iron Maiden songs, but I never hated this track. I mean, it is not fantastic by any means, but it's not the worst Iron Maiden song, if anything. I mean, I actually enjoy this song more so than Holy Smoke, but as far as on at least the level of at least good Iron Maiden, it is just, it's not the best track here. Finally, the album ends with Mother Russia, which again is one of the, again, a underrated freaking track. This track, I'm surprised, doesn't get busted out more so in some of Iron Maiden's, at least in their concert, in their live staple. I'm surprised it doesn't. This is actually a very good track off the album. It's actually very underrated, this song. And actually, at least one of my friends on Facebook who I've known since also the Force of Steel forum, I'm not going to name any names, but still, when I first pointed out that at least on my thoughts on the album when I first got it, I said, this album really isn't that bad. He did say, while he's not a fan of this record, he didn't say it's not a terrible record, but when it comes to Iron Maiden, he does say it's a bad record. But he said that Mother Russia is by far the absolute best song off the album. So at least I think that might give you the hint, that gave me the hint that I think most Iron Maiden fans, I think even Cover Killer Nation, when he did his list of some of the best final tracks, at least the album enders, the best, he definitely rated Mother Russia as one of the best songs by far off the album. And again, for very good reason. This, again, it's a very underrated track. At times, it has a very fast, upbeat feel. And I should even also, I failed to mention about Tail Gunner, is Nickelback Brain actually does bust out a little bit of the double bass here and there. He does have some, both Tail Gunner and Mother Russia definitely show that Nickelback Brain is at least a bit of a good drummer in his own right, and definitely does tend to have at least a good pacing. He does sound pretty good. I mean, yes, Nickelback Brain, I will not say he's anywhere close to at least Clive Burr, but Nickelback Brain, I think, holds his own water for sure. Again, just a great drummer, and he does do I think this is one of the highlights, at least for the album for sure, as far as great moments. I mean, I don't mind this album to begin with, but as far as really good moments, Mother Russia is a fantastic track, and it was a great way to end the album. So there you go. There's No Prayer for the Dying. Now, since this album, again, not a bad record at all. After this, they would, of course, do Fear the Dark, which I actually think is somewhat of another underrated Iron Maiden album. And I've seen people call that overrated. I've seen some people say Fear the Dark is overrated. Most people I've known have always said that album isn't that great to begin with. So I don't know. I think that's because you hear a few people say that that album is absolutely great. It's so underrated. Doesn't mean that now that album is now overrated. You have to at least hear way more people that call something underrated, or at least rate something even higher, that really call something overrated. Okay, I'm just gonna at least set that record straight. Still, though, this album, this was definitely not a bad one, and after Fear of the Dark, that was kind of it for at least Bruce Dickinson in the band, and that's led, of course, to the Blaze Bayley era, which is usually considered the black sheep of the Iron Maiden catalog, and those two albums are considered the black sheeps. Still, though, I don't hate those albums. If anything, I don't find No Prayer for the Dying to be the most worst, or at times the most boring Iron Maiden album. No, to me, that reputation, again, that trophy for me goes to Virtual 11. That goes to the final album with Blaze Bayley. That album is I for some reason I can't get into that album. I just cannot, and it just doesn't do much for me. I can't tell you why. I can probably say the production maybe, but I just don't think the songs were quite there. I actually get more enjoyment out of No Prayer for the Dying than I do Virtual 11, and that is a hot take. That is a absolute hot take on my end. So there. Definitely not a bad album at all. So really, I just don't see this album as being the worst Iron Maiden album to begin with. So, I babbled on quite a bit. So with that, I know this album hit its 30th anniversary. Again, for those who grew up at the time and again, who probably were aware that when this album came out, what were your reactions? Where were you when this album first came out? What were your thoughts when it first came out? Did you buy it? And if you did, again, what were your reactions? Did you react the same as every other Iron Maiden fan? Or did you have a different opinion compared to every other Iron Maiden fan? What were your thoughts when this album first came out? So, but for those who haven't heard this album, I would not say that this is an album that you probably should start your Iron Maiden collection off with. No, I would not. This is one it should be at least one of the final albums to get into, though right next to Virtual Eleven. I would say that is the absolute final album you should ever fucking listen to. But if you want to get into Iron Maiden, just start off with the classic Paul Di'Anno era, or start with any of the classic Bruce Dickinson era albums. Just start with some of those if you want to get into Iron Maiden. That's all I'm going to say. This is one of the albums you should get into if you want something that scratches the Bruce Dickinson era itch. So that, I would say, that should be at least my take on that. But still, as an album of its own, I just think it's not too bad. So with that, I hope all enjoyed this Every Thrash I Say. I'm out. I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.